Isolation is making everything harder. We are already separated from one another. We're already divorced from the kind of love and support we get from face-to-face and real community. And now, as we look on what's being hurt and damaged by COVID, of all the fears that it awakens, we're being hit and reminded of how deep the racism is in American culture, and it's almost too much to carry and hold on to. It's heartbreaking, and I so want to be with you all for Shabbat. I want to be together and draw strength from one another, because we, Kol Emet, are a community that works hard to be a blessing in the world. We know we're imperfect, and we know we sometimes get it wrong, and we work really hard to do good and be allies and friends of those also striving to do good in the world. So I want to say a little bit about what's been happening this week and some of my own thoughts about what Torah has to instruct us. It has been heartbreaking to watch these reminders of how deep and systemic racism is in American culture. For those who watch the video of Amanda Cooper, it's very disturbing. We see this white woman with a dog arguing with a black man and threatening him, weaponizing the police. He says to her to leash her dog. She says, I'm feeling under threat and I'm going to call the police and I'm going to tell them I'm being threatened by a black man. And she knows exactly what she's doing. She's relying on a history of police abuse of black people and suggesting to this man that if he persists in his reasonable request, that she's going to threaten him and weaponize the police on him. And he, very dignified manner, never backs down and just says, please call the police, but you need to leash your dog. It's horrifying to watch because she looks like anyone. And she could be somebody who in other settings presents themselves as an ally to black people, who would deny any kind of racism, but in that moment weaponize something that lives deep in our culture. And then we saw the horrific murder of George Floyd. You know, I've watched the tape and it's so disturbing to hear, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. There are 3 people watching it go on, and they violate the most basic biblical commandment: do not stand idly by your brother's blood. You know, I've always understood that to mean we have to help people who are in need. But this was literal. He is murdering someone and the other officers do nothing. It's horrible to watch. They didn't see their brother lying on the ground there. They saw a black man. They saw a criminal, a perpetrator, and they did nothing. And what's even more upsetting is the coroner's office and others circled round and thought about trying to cover it up until the tapes were released. I worry about that kind of racism, and I worry about police departments that can circle around perpetrators in such a way. And when we look at the problem, it's easy to feel like it's too big for us. It's easy to feel like we're grasshoppers in the face of an incredible cultural issue that is taking generations to resolve. But I want to tell you for a minute about the Israelites in the desert, and I want to suggest that if we can be people of faith, we can make a difference right now, and we can be part of the healing for the horrors of this moment. The Israelites are asked by God to send some spies to check out the land before they go in. And so Moses appoints 12 leaders to go into the land. And while they're there and walking around, they feel overwhelmed by what they see. They return and 10 of them say, the people of the land were like giants and we were as grasshoppers in our eyes. In other words, we looked and what we saw was a problem we could never overcome. And it made us feel too small. And this results in the Israelites being in the desert for another 40 years. Because God realizes that this community isn't ready for the challenge of creating and building their own just society. We are facing a similar moment. If we look at the problems that we see right now in our culture, and we say that we are too small and we're like grasshoppers in the face of unsolvable problems, then we too are going to be fated to wander in another desert for at least 40 years. We have a responsibility to not stand idly by, but to stand up for and to build connections and alliances with black people in our culture and to find ways of overcoming some of this deep racism and violence in police work and elsewhere in our society. It is not okay and it must stop. So how do we do it? How do we make the problem something that can be like a grasshopper instead of a giant. I believe part of the solution is to start with where the deepest issues lie. We know that police departments are offering different models of what it can be to do policing in the United States right now. Police departments that train their officers in de-escalation, that require their officers to wear body cams, that do interaction with the neighborhoods and send beat cops out to get to know people, we see those police departments having great successes. I believe the Palo Alto department to be one such example. We saw something amazing out of Oakland PD that inspired police departments across the country to join with the protesters. They were being begged to kneel, and a few officers, they decided to take a knee. And it is amazing to watch that whole blue line, all that line of cops in their riot gear, kneel and say to the protesters, "We are with you. We're outraged that George Floyd could be murdered by one of our brethren, and we kneel. And we join with you because we want you to understand that we have a job to keep our community safe, but we stand with you on the larger issue." And it diffused what could have been a much more violent protest into something very peaceful and wonderful. And I want to suggest that if we can encourage and demand that police departments train like that, we will see a big change in American culture. But that's not enough. We need to realize that there are some real problems in our culture that are deep. There are issues of how people are educated and what kind of access people have to health and other kinds of models. And the truth is, we need to start building coalitions to really think about what we can do as a community to bring chesed and love into how we interact with everyone. You know, I think those 3 officers standing by the murder are the worst villains of the whole story because they stood by and they did nothing. I want us to get involved. I want us to make friends who are black and brown and white and of different backgrounds and races and creeds so that we can begin to broaden our own understanding of how people see the world. We don't have to agree with what everyone says, but it's critical for us to have friends who pull us outside of our own communities and cultures so we start to understand deep and systemic pain that people may feel. We have to step outside of our comfort zone in our immediate communities and build bonds so that we can begin to understand why and how people react in the ways that they do. Only then can we become God's agents of healing. We are all created in the image of God, but that means we have to get to know each other to understand what it is that God looks like. Every time you walk outside and get to know somebody new, you are learning a facet of God. And when you encounter a new culture or race or creed, you are learning a whole set of information about what the divine really is in the universe. So look, there is a temptation right now, in part because we are isolated, to retreat back into our various camps and partisan identities. And that would be a catastrophe right now. There is a great issue and a moment to be seized. We can actually change American culture. We can actually address police violence, and we can actually do something about systemic racism, and so we must. And that means we need to look for the biggest possible coalitions to effect real and lasting change. That means we need to start creating friendships and connections that will help us broaden our viewpoint. That means we need to really search our own hearts to understand how we can help create strong, overwhelming majorities of people in favor of noticing God's image in every person. And I believe that that change will come not through hatred and anger and violence, but it will come through acts of compassion and understanding and love. When the Oakland PD kneeled and inspired police departments across the country, they changed the dynamic dramatically of these protests. And it was an act of understanding and compassion and love, and that's why I'm so inspired by it. So look, we have a big challenge ahead of us. It's going to be easy to say we are grasshoppers in the face of insoluble problems. But we are people of faith, Colomet. We are people who care. We are people who've made the effort to build bonds with other communities. We so value our friendship with University Church. Many of us went to Israel to spend a couple weeks in the Holy Land with a black church, and it was amazing. We know and are beginning to learn and have empathy for a whole other community. And that's the first step, but it's only the first step. And so I urge everybody to think, how can we be a force of healing and good in the world? How can we help in our own interactions and in larger ways affect real and meaningful change? How can we realize that it is the problems that are grasshoppers because we are giants walking with God? And I want to say also that those who are bringing violence into this, those who are abusing the seriousness of these protests to loot and destroy, are undermining a critical message that we must hear and must give heed. So Israel, so my friends, we are commanded Shema Yisrael to hear. This is a time for listening and learning and action that heals and brings chesed into the world. Shabbat Shalom, my dear and beloved Kolonet.